All right. Welcome, everybody, to the climate lecture series put on by Evergreen's Center for Climate Action and Sustainability. I'm Anthony Lavenda. I'm the director of the Climate Center at Evergreen and a member of the faculty here teaching classes around climate policy and climate action. Thanks, everyone. I'm just going to start by reading through Evergreen's tribal acknowledgement. We gratefully acknowledge and honor the Squaxin Island tribe, upon whose traditional homelands the Evergreen State College Olympia campus is situated. For thousands of years, their ancestral families lived and thrived here. They named Bud Inlet Stichas and Eld Inlet, where the campus is located, Squattle. Today, the Squaxin Island tribe continues to live on and steward the lands and waters of the southern Salish Sea. We also gratefully acknowledge the Puyallup tribe, whose traditional lands Evergreen's Tacoma campus is located upon. We respect and acknowledge the Squaxin Island and Puyallup tribes and other tribes across the Americas and their many contributions to the Evergreen State College in support of education, tribal sovereignty, and environmental stewardship. This acknowledgement is one very small step toward respect and collaboration with the aim of uplifting the voices, cultures, and histories of the tribes of these lands and waters. So welcome everybody. Today I'm really excited to welcome our guest, Dr. Mijin Cha from UC Santa Cruz. Dr. Cha is an assistant professor of environmental studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She's also a fellow at Cornell University's Climate Jobs Institute and a fellow at the Climate and Community Institute. Her research looks at the intersection of inequality and the climate crisis and how to advance something called the just transition, which I'm sure we'll hear more about here in a minute. Um, Dr. Cha is on the board of the Greenpeace Fund and a member of the California Bar. Dr. Cha is also the author of a new book from MIT Press called A Just Transition for All Workers and Communities for a Carbon-Free Future. I think um, with that introduction, I just wanted to offer a few just other comments about how we might be framing, thinking about the futures we're all facing as the political climate in the U.S. has shifted with the current administration, undercutting a lot of public support for example, renewable energy and environmental protection, as well as the sort of responses that we're starting to see emerging from longstanding environmental justice and climate justice movements that have been prepared for this. So I find this talk is going to be really exciting and helpful for us as we think through kind of what's going to happen in the future, but also learning from just transition that's been happening and unfolding for quite a long time. And so it's really a pleasure to have you here, Mijin, speaking with us. And with that, I just wanted to hand it over to you and let everybody know that this is a recorded Zoom call, Zoom webinar. It'll be available on our website later, but also that we are going to host a sort of question and answer section in a little bit after Dr. Cha's talk, and I will moderate the questions. So feel free to write your questions in the Q&A function on Zoom, and I will share those with Dr. Cha, and we'll get to those at the end of the talk. So go ahead. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Anthony and Evergreen College for inviting me here today. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I appreciate everyone who's joining this talk today. A special hello to my CSP and ANVS students. So as Anthony mentioned, my name is Mijin Cha. I'm an assistant professor at UC Santa Cruz, and today I'm going to say a few words about this idea of just transition and how we can save it from neoliberalism. So I had to rewrite a lot of this talk because even though I thought the incoming administration would be bad, I didn't expect it to be this bad this quickly. So even though I knew there would be a rollback of any kind of climate policy, I wasn't expecting this wholesale attack on institutions. And it seems a little tone deaf and politically blind to talk as though we're dealing with a legitimate opponent. Instead, what we seem to be on the precipice of is what scholars call a self-coup, which is where an elected official, head of state, proceeds to take over aspects of governance outside of their scope in order to consolidate power. How this resolves with democracy and democratic institutions intact is very unclear. But at the same time, we are in the middle of a climate crisis. And while this administration is intent on drilling and extracting us into oblivion, we are not powerless. And one thing that we can do is build something that offers an actual alternative to the neoliberalism that has dominated our political and economic system for decades. And here I think it's helpful to think about what we talk about when we talk about neoliberalism. So on the left, we have two of the leading thinkers of neoliberalism, Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, and two of the most famous politicians who advanced neoliberalism as their governing philosophy, the former US President Ronald Reagan and the former Prime Minister of the UK, Margaret Thatcher. In short and to the point, neoliberalism is the idea that economic markets can solve public problems. It puts faith in the private sector and individuals to address public issues. Ronald Reagan's famous quote was, "The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I am here from the government and I'm here to help." This governing philosophy believes that all we have to do is unleash the market. Let it do what it's meant to do and problems will be solved. The role of government in this ideology is very minimal. And a recent example of this in the climate world is the Inflation Reduction Act. Analysis by the consulting firm McKinsey found that corporations will be the greatest beneficiary of the IRA because it is essentially industrial policy implemented through tax credits and incentives to the private sector. So if we see here, this is a chart of how funding in the Inflation Act is distributed. And as you can see, nearly half, 64.8 billion and 62.3 billion is for renewable energy and clean electricity investment and production tax credits. Those are tax credits that will be given to the private sector to invest and produce clean energy. The rest of the money, excuse me, is also in the form of grants, loans, and tax credits to private sector and to individuals to advance these other climate initiatives. Note that there is no money for any kind of fossil fuel drawdown or the ending of fossil fuels, but just money to do what we call supply side, producing as much renewable energy, electric vehicles, EV charging, all of those things, through grants, loans, and tax credits. The governing philosophy here is clear. It is the role of the government to facilitate the private sector solving a public issue, which in this case is, of course, climate change. A different approach would have been if the government had, for instance, directly hired people to build utility scale solar, or do the work of a massive retrofit program, which would retrofit every building in the country to be more energy efficient, which then would not only, of course, make those spaces healthier, but would reduce energy demand. And of course, the less energy that is required, the less energy we have to produce. Or, for instance, the government could receive ownership shares in exchange for these grants and loans given to private companies. In this way, any profit that is made would be shared with the public rather than the current approach, which is that the public is only subsidizing private profits. In addition to what is essentially a transfer of public funds to subsidize private profits, the neoliberal approach isolates the individual, which means that you think it is the private company that is the one that is giving you the job and not because of government support. So the role of government is removed and the average person doesn't connect that it is in fact government that is behind this job creation. And as a result, it becomes easy to attack the idea of government because what it does and how it makes people's lives better is unclear. What is clear, though, is the propaganda pushed by corporations like the fossil fuel industry that they are an important employer and the main economic engine in many regions. That is, in fact, that the fossil fuel industry is the one that should be able to and should be trusted to solve these problems. But of course, we know that the truth is that the economic returns from fossil fuels have been declining over the years. Fewer jobs and fewer benefits to communities. And while there are always boom and bust cycles where employment has increased and decreased based on the market price of oil, gas, and coal, there has been a steady decline in fossil fuel employment since 2015. And though employment is decreasing, what does remain constant, however, is the pollution from burning fossil fuels in communities, and that is being inhaled by people that live in communities and the workers that work in these regions. And instead of profits being returned largely to communities, they are concentrated in the hands of executives and shareholders. So where does this leave us? I argue that this is the moment for a bold vision and a true just transition away from both fossil fuels and away from neoliberalism. It is an opportunity to present a vision that is markedly and meaningfully different. We cannot fight fascism with fascism light. We cannot have the current reality with one party being rabidly pro-fossil fuels and the opposition also touting how much they love fracking. Because in this case, what is the choice if you care about climate, right? Do you go for the person that is all above and all in on fossil fuels, or the person that is telling you how much they love fracking? And of course, this is not trite enough to flatten the discussion into that there is no difference between political parties, right? Less evil is objectively a better choice. But what I'm asking is that, is there a way for us to build something new and different and not just continue down this neoliberal path? And in fact, I argue that just transition is the way to offer another path, a path that doesn't require choosing the lesser evil, but a way out of neoliberalism and into a future where people and planet are central to society, not private profits. So this is a picture of the late great labor leader Tony Mazzocchi, who is often seen as a leading thinker behind what we now call just transition. But Mazzocchi didn't care only about workers, and the idea of what we now call just transition was developed alongside environmental justice leaders. Mazzocchi was the head of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, and he argued that there were some industries that are too toxic for society to continue. Then at the time, it was the chemical and atomic industry, and I think now we could argue that it is the fossil fuel industry. The fossil fuel industry is too toxic for us to continue for the benefit of society. But Mazzocchi argued that as we move away from these industries, the burden of moving away should not fall on workers and communities who depend upon these industries. Meaning that as we phase out these industries, it shouldn't be that we just leave workers and communities without any kind of alternative when they have become economically dependent upon these industries. Mazzocchi coined the term, Superfund for Workers, which was modeled on the US Superfund program, which required polluting industries to set money aside to pay for cleanup. In the narrowest form, just transition refers to what happens to fossil fuel workers and communities dependent on fossil fuels. And there was a moment when just transition was becoming very popular in climate discussions, such that even the big oil majors had vague promises around a just transition for workers. But as it became more popular, it became more narrow and neoliberalized. So what does just transition mean? So this quote is from an organizer that we interviewed as part of research that I conducted with my colleague Manuel Pastor at the University of Southern California and his research institute, Equity Research Institute. We did two projects together on trying to understand what just transition means and what just transition looks like, especially for people who are in directly impacted regions. What do they think of as just transition, and what were their views and hopes for a just transition? So this quote is from an Eastern Kentucky organizer who says, quote, "I could go out to the street or I could go to Walmart. I could stop 25 people. None of them would know what just transition means. You stop anybody and ask them what war on coal means. They know that. It's like, man, progressives tend to hide what they're doing and then create a language that's only for the elite. And I think that what we've done, everybody goes through a transition, right? You're getting a divorce, it's a transition. You lose your job, it's a transition. We know this terminology. The whole idea of a just transition meaning fair, more equitable, thoughtful, and green, none of that really resonates. And so it's basically a language made up for elites, by elites, for elites, to keep regular people out of the debate. And I think there are two really important points that this quote raises. One, the idea of just transition is somewhat meaningless, right? It doesn't tell you what they mean by just, what you mean by what you're transitioning away from. And then if you contrast that with the war on coal, right? What is happening? There is a war on what? On coal, right? So it's very clear on what is happening. But just transition is just this idea that doesn't tell you what we're transitioning away from or to, and what you mean by the term just. But I think what is important to underscore here, though, is that while there is opposition to this terminology of just transition, or the idea that you can just say just transition and someone will know what you mean, it is not necessarily an opposition away from fossil fuels, right? So while there is an opposition to the terminology of just transition, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is an opposition to an energy transition. And I think this is important not to reinforce the idea that fossil fuel regions are unified in their support of fossil fuels, right? Rather, it is opposition to the idea that you can make change only through jargon and messaging, and not doing the work of organizing and talking to people in ways that they can understand and in ways in which they feel that their concerns are seen. So I think this then raises a lot of questions about the idea of just transition. Is there even a reason to define just transition? How far can a term really take us? And while we don't want to be prescriptive, meaning, for instance, that just transition means exactly this and that looks exactly like that, it is helpful to have a term to organize ideas and policies around. And there are principles of just transition that I assert are fundamental to the idea of just transition. So as Anthony mentioned, my book, A Just Transition for All Workers and Communities for a Carbon-Free Future, was released by MIT Press in December, and it's also available for open access. And in my book, I lay out a definition of just transition that has two principles. One, a transition away from fossil fuels. This seems somewhat obvious, but we need a transition away from fossil fuels. And often when we think about an energy transition, we think about renewable energy production. And certainly renewable energy production has increased, right? If you look at this graph starting in about 2000, there's an undeniable market increase in wind, solar, hydropower, and other renewables, and the trend is certainly upwards. And also in the US, for instance, same thing. So the wind and utility scale solar we see have been steadily increasing since 2015 and are expected to continue to increase beyond 2024. And undoubtedly and undeniably, this is a good thing, right? But at the same time, we see that fossil fuel production is also increasing, right? So globally, we see that fossil fuels are on an ever-increasing trajectory. Some decline in the 1980s, but that has been made up for. Some decline again during times of, for instance, the pandemic, but that increase still continues despite and makes up for these dips in production. And not just globally, but oil and gas production is also increasing in the US. And what I want to note, especially here, is that if you see starting in about 2015, 2016, oil and gas production is continually on an increase. But if you remember from just a few slides ago, oil and gas employment in the oil and gas industry is actually decreasing around the same time period, which means that even there's more oil and gas being produced with fewer workers. So that means that there are less people producing more oil and gas, largely through automation, which means that there are more profits for the fossil fuel companies as they continue to decrease employment in these industries. And far from being from peak oil, which is what they call peak oil, where oil and gas production is expected to reach its apex and start to decline, we actually expect this trend of increasing production of oil and gas to continue. Because if you look at, for instance, natural gas production, we are on a really rapid increase for natural gas production in the US. And this graph of natural gas production shows two very important points. One is around 2008, which is when President Obama lifted the ban on gas exports. And so a whole export market for natural gas opens. And then you see another huge increase starting in about 2017 when liquefied natural gas, LNG exports, start being exported. And I'll also note that the IRA has significant support for building new LNG terminals. So as you see this increase, we actually expect LNG production to continue to increase because as new LNG terminals are constructed, once they are built, we can anticipate about locking in at least 10 to 20 years of continued supply because those capital costs of building the terminal have to be recouped. So you don't build an LNG terminal just to have exporting gas exports for 2 to 3 years. We must expect that there will be at least 10 to 20 more years of gas exports because of the construction of all these terminals. And you can expect that there will be a push for policy to support the increase in exports if the market doesn't support that increase in exports. And in fact, the US is the top natural gas producer. If you see this graph between Iran, Russia, and the US overtook Russia around the same time the export ban was lifted in 2008, around 2008, 2009, and has continued to increase rapidly. So why I say that the first element of just transition is that there has to be a transition away from fossil fuels is that we are in fact not transitioning away from fossil fuels. Instead, we are experiencing what sociologists Richard York and Shannon Bell call an energy addition, where renewable energy is generated in addition to the fossil fuel energy that is being produced and consumed. And part of why we are continually adding energy is that the focus of climate efforts is somewhat around the assumption of endless energy supply. So we hear much less about energy efficiency, i.e. ways to reduce energy use, which again, if we reduce energy demand, we then need to produce less energy. Instead, the discussion around energy systems is focused largely on renewable energy generation and how much we can produce. In the Inflation Reduction Act, for instance, the support for renewable energy investment and generation dwarfs the support for energy efficiency measures. And again, objectively, producing renewable energy is good. But the idea that we can endlessly produce renewable energy is counter to the fundamentals of a just transition. And we see this discussion now around AI and data centers, right? The energy required for these technologies is not compatible with climate goals. And we see fossil fuel plants, for instance, that were shut down being restarted to feed this energy demand. So the idea that we can limitlessly produce energy is of course false because it continues the same level of extraction and extractive practices, just in a different form, right? So instead of extracting and producing fossil fuels, we are extracting where they're extracting the critical minerals that are needed for renewable energy production to unsustainable levels, right? So both systems are extracting resources to unsustainable levels. So it is clear that for a just transition, there must be an actual transition away from fossil fuels, which means a decrease in fossil fuel production and use, not just an energy addition. So not just adding renewable energy to our fossil fuel production and consumption, but actually replacing fossil fuel consumption and production with renewable energy. So if that's the first component of just transition, a transition away from fossil fuels, the second component is that transition must be just. And here I think, again, it sounds somewhat obvious, but it is particularly important not to define what justice looks like in every context and every place, because just transition will look different in Kentucky as it will than in California. And of course, just transition will look much different for the global North as it does for the global South. So being overly prescriptive about the term just and what is just is contrary to the idea of just transition fundamentally, right? But I think, again, that doesn't mean that there are not principles that we should follow in trying to advance a just transition. One, justice must come from the ground up, which means that affected communities and those that will directly experience the impacts of transition should be the ones to detail what would make transition just for them. And that will look different in different ways. But I think fundamental to this is something that the Japanese philosopher Kohei Saito says in his book, Marx and the Anthropocene, which is that the same systems that cause the problem cannot be relied upon to solve the problem. So there are people that think that climate change is caused by greenhouse gas emissions only. And therefore, what we have is actually an emissions problem, not a fossil fuel problem. And this worldview would agree that we can continue to use fossil fuels as long as we capture and remove the emissions, right? But then there are other people who think that climate change is a natural product of an extractive and exploitative capitalist economy. And without countering this view through moving away from extraction, we cannot ever capture or remove our way out of the climate crisis. So applying what Saito says here is that as capitalism is what has brought us to this point, capitalism, green or otherwise, cannot solve the very problem it has created, which means that climate policy that only focuses on market-based solutions, such as tax credits and incentives, will not be able to meaningfully reduce emissions. And rather, we must move away from this idea of an extractive economy to one that is more regenerative. So what would that look like? Sorry. So this graph is from a community-based organization called the Movement Generation. And on the left, you have the extractive economy, which, as you can see, is centered and powered by work and exploitation that then that requires resource extraction, burning and dumping of resources, and the extraction of labor and people, overwork and exploitation. And then the purpose of it, right, is to enclose and accumulate as much wealth and power as possible. And that is then, of course, made possible by this worldview of consumerism and a colonial mindset and a governing philosophy of militarism. So if we are moved from this extractive economy vision to one of regeneration, you see that instead of thinking about resources as things that need to be exploited and extracted to their full, we think about resource use in a regenerative way. We think of work in a cooperative way, and the purpose is for ecological well-being. And then this vision of the regenerative economy is fed through deep democracy and caring and sacredness. So instead of thinking that we can just green the image on the right and result in the image on the, we can just green the image on the left and result in the image on the right, we have to fundamentally change the way we think about work, fundamentally change the way we think about extraction and the way that we extract, and fundamentally rethink what the purpose of economies and societies are, right? Moving from capital accumulation to systems where everybody has the means of which they can thrive. So I think the next question becomes, so how do we start how do we go from this big idea of dismantling capitalism to actually what does it look like and what does it mean in practice? And so here is a graphic from that I made for this talk, but that I should have included in my book, but that I didn't. That is an overview of this governance framework that my colleague Manuel Pastor and I have developed through our research on just transition. And we looked at just transition cases in the country and across the globe to think about what elements worked to advance a just transition. And I should note that there are very few examples of a just transition. And that's largely because of our inability to support workers and communities in the aftermath of transition. Transition in and of itself is not unjust, right? As economies develop and mature, transition is inevitable. But our inability to support workers and communities through this transition is what makes transition unjust. So what we have here are the four pillars of a just transition. And I'll just go through these briefly and spend more time talking about two of them. But one is strong governmental support. So that's the idea along these lines of that we can't leave transition to the private sector, right? We cannot have a profit generated and profit motivated energy transition. Instead, we need to think about how the public sector can enable and engage in this energy transition, excuse me. And I'll note here that this is not meant to be an uncritical support of the state, because often the state is the one that is the perpetrator of injustice, right? But the argument is that if we choose between a public sector driven just transition versus a private sector driven transition, you have to remove the profit motive, because there are things that will require funding without any kind of profit that cannot be captured by the profit incentive, right? So if we want to redevelop a fossil fuel region, for instance, that takes about at least 10 years of continuous support, and that is incompatible with this idea of a quarterly profit-driven system. Also, many of the supports that we will need for just transition, such as unemployment insurance and other supports, are already administered through the public sector. So rather than recreating those systems in the private sector, we should grow the role of the public sector. And I think this is particularly important to articulate now, while we're seeing the complete dismantling and attack on the public sector driven by an unelected and unaccountable billionaire. And you're seeing exactly how much government actually does and why there are instances where we cannot be profit driven, such as public safety, food safety, and I would argue now also the energy transition. The second pillar is economic diversification. Part of the challenge for an energy transition is that many of these regions, particularly the rural regions, are monodependent on the fossil fuel industry. So when the fossil fuel industry winds down, there's nothing to take its place. So people are left without jobs and without any kind of economic opportunity. So rather than replacing a mono industry with another mono industry, such as a big box store like Walmart, having a series of different types of industries makes economies more resilient, and localizing as much as possible also makes them more resilient and less vulnerable to economic disruption. The third pillar is dedicated funding streams. Something that I talk a lot about in my book is that because we are unable to fund transition programs at the level that they need for the time that they need, we have inconsistency across the programs. So for instance, the Trade Adjustment Act, which is the largest program to support workers that were displaced by globalization, is really dependent upon whatever political party is in power. So when Democrats are in power, it's well-funded. When they're not, it's unfunded. And in fact, the last administration was unable to reauthorize the program, so it is effectively ended. And that kind of inconsistency in funding support is really challenging, particularly if we think about something like diversifying an economy, a local economy, or trying to train for new skills, right? We need dedicated funding, dedicated and consistent funding. And the last one is strong and diverse coalitions, which I'll talk about more in depth in a minute. But the idea being that, of course, this cannot be a top-down approach. It cannot be something that people in a room decide what is best, that we really need to have strong and diverse coalitions that are built from the ground up to push for a just transition. And then on top of all of this is this idea of non-reformist reforms, which I'll again talk about more in a little bit. So that's the basic structure for the four pillars for a just transition. And I want to talk more in depth now about strong and diverse coalitions and this idea of non-reformist reforms. So I really love this graphic because especially I think in this moment where it shows that if there are just a few of us, we cannot actually, overcome a bigger entity, but in fact that there are more of us, right? And when there are more of us and we organize, we can in fact fight back. And I think this is particularly important in this moment when people feel very powerless and feel like they're alone. And I will again underscore that the point of neoliberalism is to focus on the individual and make it feel like we are alone and that we are not in community. But in fact, we know that that is not true, right? And so the reason why strong and diverse coalitions are important are for many reasons, but two that I will highlight is one, we want to ensure that the policy is targeted and appropriate for the use. So when we're thinking about regions that need to transition away from fossil fuels, the people that work and live in that region know what they need best, right? So understanding what their needs are then actually creates more effective and more appropriate policy for transition. I'd like to contrast this with, for instance, there's this theory in economics called that people move to opportunity. So for instance, if your job goes away, it's fine because another job will be created elsewhere and you can just move to where the new job is. But in interviews that we did as part of the Just Transition Listening Project, where we interviewed over 100 people who either experienced transition or were on the verge of transition, we found that in fact, some people move, and usually they tend to be younger and without families, but many people stay because there are reasons why you live somewhere beyond just your job, your family, other opportunities, that's where you've grown up, all of these other aspects that cannot be accounted for. And so if we don't think about the importance of place-based job creation, we actually just leave all those folks behind, right? Because they, in fact, do not just move to opportunity. So when you talk to people who are facing transition or are experiencing transition, those are the kinds of insights that you gain that realize that this idea that we had that people will move to opportunity is not only false, but is actually increasing injustice, right? And so when we engage directly impacted stakeholders from the beginning, we actually create better and more effective public policy. And the second reason is because of this graphic, right? So it's one thing to have an idea and to have a policy, but as we know, an idea on paper is just an idea on paper. What we need to then do is think about how do we advance that policy? And to advance that policy, as many of you know, we need power. And you build power either through money or through people. And we'll never have as much money, regret to inform you, as billionaires that are in charge now. So we need people. And when you engage communities from the ground up, from the beginning, right? The other mistake that people often make is they have an idea that's already formed and then they ask people to sign on to it. That's not actually organizing, right? And so when you engage people from the beginning, you then also build the political power that you need to advance your policy, right? You build that constituency that is already bought into the idea because they feel like they are part of the problem, that are part of the solution, and also that their needs are being seen. And that constituency can be mobilized to create the political power that you need to advance your policy. So I think it's important to also remember that policy is more than power is more than a policy win. So this quote is from an organizer who works in the Gulf South, and they're working on a multi-state vision for the Gulf Coast. And what they were saying to us was that, quote, my definition of a win now is watching power be built, being able to see power built. For the first time, 100 groups plus across 5 states said, I'm going to be in charge of my own destiny. I'm going to put down what I want to see. I'm not going to wait for somebody to give it to me. We're going to declare what we want and we're going to move it together. And that is power building. We're building a movement. We're not building a piece of policy. So what I think is really moving about this quote, right, is that I think too often we think of the policy and the legislation as the win, and then there's nothing after that. But instead, when you think about organizing, what you're doing when you organize is that you build infrastructure, you build social infrastructure, right? And then that social infrastructure can begin to push for bigger and more ambitious long-term change. So when we think about organizing, right, we're not just thinking in the narrow terms of like, what do we need to do to then just ensure that this one piece of legislation gets passed, but in fact, what kind of infrastructure can we build for the long term? And that kind of infrastructure building requires that you directly engage with people who are on the ground and you engage them from the beginning, right? So again, we don't want to think about creating all of this policy and then bringing people in at the end just to endorse your idea, but really thinking about how can we build something together. And this, I think, brings us full circle, which is what is this future that we're trying to build and how do we get there? So after the four pillars came out, after each of our research projects, we released reports that kind of detailed our findings. But after the four pillars were out and I was writing my book, I realized that while the four pillars were necessary, they're not sufficient to ensure a just transition. And what I mean by that is because they could guarantee, for instance, that the public sector was involved and that there were dedicated funding streams and all of that, but they could not guarantee that we would move away from the same systems and structures that brought us to this point. And as Kohai Saito discusses, right, the public sector engaging in capitalism doesn't actually solve the problem, right? Then you just have public capitalism. And so as I was thinking through what do we need then to think about how do we build something new, I came across this idea of non-reformist reforms, which is something that labor scholars and abolitionists talk about, which is how do you advance programs and policies with these existing structures, like existing legislatures and regulatory systems, that then eventually move away from these systems. So for instance, abolitionists talk about how we cannot make prisons more human because there are no good prisons, right? So rather than trying to make a just system in incarceration, we can think about ways in which we can, for instance, take money from police budgets to fund supportive housing and other community accountability mechanisms that don't extract people from their communities. And so while we're winding down one extractive system of the prison industrial complex, we are building another way of being that doesn't continue the system of extraction. So thinking about ways in which we can work within existing systems and institutions while we are building something that is new. Or we can think about this example in terms of fossil fuel extraction. So as I mentioned before, there can be no just transition without a wind down of the fossil fuel industry. And one way we can do this is by limiting where oil and gas extraction can occur. So in California, California is the first to pass something called a setback law, which is that as this picture indicates, right, oil and gas drilling used to be able to be built to be drilled anywhere, including right next to houses, right next to schools, right next to hospitals, and right next to any kind of where people are living and working and worshiping. And so the idea started from a very small community in the Central Valley, which is the heart of oil and gas drilling in California, called Arvin, that passed a 600-foot setback bill. That bill was so controversial because it was the first attempt to rein in any kind of fossil fuel extraction that the fossil fuel industry went all out to try to stop it, right? And through an electoral campaign, through a legislative campaign, through legal measures, through organizing, the community was able to not only protect their setback measure, but also ensure that it didn't get repealed and that it was actually implemented. That then set the stage for a statewide initiative, which increased that setback limit to 3,200 feet, which was then, of course, again challenged by the fossil fuel industry, such that California has this ridiculous system of governing through propositions. So they gathered enough signatures to put a repeal of the bill on the ballot, and even that was eventually defeated. So you can see why the fossil fuel industry was so concerned about this, because it was the first attempt to really rein in where they can drill. So now the setback bill is in place, and there can be no new drilling 3,200 feet within 3,200 feet of what's considered to be sensitive places, which are schools, hospitals, churches, and residential areas. And this kind of policy then starts to restrict where fossil fuel production can occur, which will restrict how much fossil fuel production can occur, right? It is a way to get through to fossil fuel drawdown. Obviously, a ban on fossil fuel drilling would be great, but as we build to that moment, we can do things within the existing system that will eventually move us away from the system. And so finally, this graphic, for those of you not familiar, excuse me, is an amendment of the original picture. And in the original picture, the cop on the right is pepper spraying UC Davis students that were handcuffed and immobile during a campus protest in 2011 during the Occupy Wall Street protest. Like he just walked by them and sprayed pepper spray in their face. And I'll note that while the officer was fired, the recommendation was just to discipline him and keep him on the force. And he was also awarded $38,000 in workman's comp from distress to him during the incident and got to keep his retirement benefits. So the extractive world is one in which police are able to pepper spray helpless students, while the regenerative one would never allow this harm to happen in the first place. So we have to believe that another world is possible, and there are steps that we can take to build that new world. So yeah, thank you. I'll stop there, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. I think while folks, please do throw your questions in the Q&A function on Zoom. Um, any questions you have to stimulate any conversation would be great. Feel free to use that function. I have a couple questions. Well, take your time, formulate them, and share them. Um, Thank you so much for that talk, Dr. Cha. And I think I can maybe get us started by just asking some general questions. Well, actually, this one maybe a little bit more specific to the idea of just transition. So here in just down the street from Evergreen is a place called Centralia, Washington, where it was the state of Washington's last coal-fired power plant exists, right? It's phased to be closed in just a few months now. And they've been working on that project for over 10 years. And maybe you're familiar by the nods, I'm guessing you're familiar with that project. Um, and from many accounts, it's sort of seen as a like best practice for just transitions. They created like a transition fund. They have these small grants for like businesses to be generated. They had this fund to help support workers moving away from the industry who worked at the plant, for example. And now from sort of my understanding, a lot of the focus is on shifting to a new kind of energy in that region, focusing on hydrogen. Something I think they're calling blue hydrogen or green hydrogen, which is supposed to be a sort of more less carbon intensive form of hydrogen production. Um, and I'm seeing this more widely that there seems to be a lot of um, sort of moving from one industry that has potential harm to another industry that has potential harm. I'm not 100% sure about all the ins and outs of hydrogen, but it seems to me that large industrial processes being just like located in the same place where other large industrial processes had been in the past might reproduce some of the harms in those communities, but are sometimes being kind of pitched under this just transition framework. And I'm wondering, based on your experience and all the interviews you did with, like, for example, the Listening Project and in your research, if you're seeing this as a broader problem. And it sounds like from the way you were setting up the definitions around just transition and trying to be more specific with it, maybe there are examples of sort of it going in the sort of wrong direction, so to say. So just sort of thought and a question, has this been something that you've seen kind of reproduced over and over again, or um, are there examples that you think are best practices?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think in these cases, it's really helpful to think about, for instance, who is it supportive of these technologies? Hydrogen is very supported by the fossil fuel industry, right? And so are things like carbon dioxide removal. Like my understanding is Occidental Petroleum has the largest demonstration plant on that. And I think this is why we can't think of what I talk about a lot in my book is that climate policy has largely been apolitical and technocratic, right? Thinking that we just need the right solution, and that's the way that we can and solve this crisis that we are in. And I think that that misses the political economy of climate change, right? And so I think we should ask if a fossil fuel company is very supportive of a policy, do you think that they would be supportive of a policy that would lead to the destruction of their industry? Of course not, right? And so I think that people couch things like hydrogen, which they keep using these different colors like blue, green, and gray. All of it, they still requires fossil fuels. Sorry. So, and I think that they're trying to wordsmith to think about what are the easiest things for us to transition into. And so I think that this is just another form of greenwashing and climate denial, right? Because the more that we delay this transition, the harder it will be, and the worse the impacts of climate change we will be locking in. And I will say also there, from a worker's perspective, I think that a lot of them would prefer to stay in place, and often it is easier to, turn an oil refinery into a hydrogen plant than to build if you build a utility scale solar system, maybe you can based on the resources, but probably not. Some of the research that we did showed that most of the solar in California, for instance, is being developed in places not where fossil fuel extraction is not occurring. And so I think that these are real challenges that we should really talk about, because I think that what we have now is this mismatch of discussion of there are hundreds of thousands, millions of jobs to be created by the energy transition, which is true. But they will not necessarily be created in areas where jobs are being lost, right? And so why I say about there has to be a transition is that anything that allows us to continue to use fossil fuels is not in fact a climate solution, because you also have to think about scale, right? And so fossil fuel industry is not going to extract like 1 ton of coal so that to fund like the 1% of hydrogen that will be made, right? They have to fund enough for it to be profitable. They have to extract enough for it to be profitable for them, which is why they want to continue these systems and processes that continue the use of fossil fuels. And so we're seeing, again, like for instance, in the Central Valley in California, they are doing all these carbon dioxide removal hubs as like a just transition project. But I will note that CDR is not innocuous infrastructure, right? It's very loud, it's very noisy, it causes a lot of disturbance to communities. And also, the analogy that I think is really helpful here is that when your bathtub is overflowing, you don't start putting like towels on the ground, you turn off the tap, right? So we can never remove enough emissions and store enough emissions. And if we're continuing to emit emissions, and these false measures like hydrogen, they will still emit emissions. And so I think that it just delays us from actually developing technology that can, we don't actually need to even do much of that, right? We can decarbonize about 80% of our economy with existing technology. And so there are just ways to delay climate action and ways to continue fossil fuel use, which is not a climate solution.
Thank you for that. And yeah, I hear a lot of discourse from communities that I partner with and talk to about these kinds of issues, that a lot of these are so-called like false solutions, right? This is a very common language among climate justice organizers, that a lot of these kind of techno fixes, for lack of a better word, are just false solutions. They're not really rooted. They're not what folks are actually asking for. And that's when you see like immediately, right? There's some disconnect happening. If it's not what folks are asking for, then where is that idea coming from?
Exactly.
And yeah, so I got a bunch of questions in the chat here. I'm gonna select a couple. I'm gonna select a couple. So the one question from Daniela um, asks, well, first says thank you for your talk. It's really great, and says it's a question around collective action for a just transition, and they're asking, do you have any examples of bottom-up regime shifts or transitions that have successfully taken place? And what are key attributes necessary for such transitions to occur without violence?
Mm. Yeah, that is such a great question. And there's a book by Vincent Bevins called If We Could, is it If We Might Burn? Is that what it's called? And he looks at, there were these waves, right? Like in Egypt and in Syria and in Indonesia and you could say the US during Black Lives Matter, these waves of like big social protests and social movements with very little change afterwards, right? So there's this big push for social change, and then it doesn't really go anywhere. And his analysis is that because the infrastructure to then take over doesn't really exist, right? So you have this like movement for social change, and maybe some people change at the top, but that the people in the bureaucracies, for instance, that actually do the work of the governance of governing and governance don't actually change, right? And so that kind of leads to this idea that we kind of need to be building something while we are thinking about moving away from something. But I think, for instance, the civil rights movement in the US is a really great example of social change, social movements leading to lasting change. And I think it's really important to remember, particularly in this time, that the civil rights movement at the time was not popular. Dr. Martin Luther King has become this like revered figure. He was extremely divisive and extremely hated by most people in the country. And in fact, so much that he got assassinated. And so I think we really whitewash a lot of how much conflict occurred during that movement, and then also how long it took, right? It wasn't just a big upswing and then it was sustained action over years that then led to legislative and policy changes that we're now seeing being rolled back. And so I think that we have to think in terms of years when we think about lasting social change, and also that I think it's really important to remember we probably will lose more than we will win, but the end win will be the big win, right? And so I think what we're missing now is this change, this infrastructure. Like even if we think about now, if we had a big public upswell and say Trump and I refuse to say his name, the other man are out of office, the infrastructure that surrounds them is still neoliberal, so it would still exist. So I think we could think of it as in tandem, right? So you need the mass movement while you're also building the institutions and structures to then be able to implement the policies that the mass movement is calling for. And I think in my mind, the civil rights movement is a really great example of how mass movements can lead to lasting change.
Wonderful. Thank you. We have a bunch more questions here in the chat. And I want to maybe, I had one set of questions that kind of, from Michael, questions that kind of relate to how this like concept of just transition might be applied to, for example, college campuses. Um, and so I'll just, Michael has a couple questions here. Um, One, and they're all around that question, but one in particular he says is, in what ways can colleges be strategic and thoughtful about integrating social justice principles into their climate action plans, like really actually taking the just transition concept and making it part of their work, either meeting state goals or doing other sort of regular college sustainability work.
That's a really good, and obviously, Anthony, if you have thoughts, I'd love to hear them too. I feel like in this moment, I feel a little bit maybe dissuaded by the ability of our current academic institutions to create change. Because you just see so many of them capitulating now, right? And complying in advance. So just mass removal of DEI from websites and all of these things that they don't actually have to do. They haven't been mandated to do them and they still lost the government funding. So by complying in advance, all you're doing is legitimizing illegitimate actions and making people who are marginalized and at risk feel more marginalized and at risk and that nobody is supporting them. So in some ways, I think there are things that that colleges and institutions can do just to create more just conditions generally, right? So one would be being very clear about the need for equity and inclusion, and supporting marginalized students. I think another thing that is really important for campuses, particularly even in our campus, which is, I think people like to call Santa Cruz a city, but it's really just a small village. But we are pretty isolated from the rest of the town, right? And so when you think about campus sustainability and the campus as just the campus, I think that by nature, you cannot think about just transition because you're just, the campus doesn't exist in isolation. And in fact, uses many city services, right? And is a part of the city. And so thinking about sustainability, I think broader than the campus and thinking about what sustainability would look like in our community, I think is one way you can think about integrating equity considerations. I also think a lot about how students are treated and engaged with, and I think campus sustainability that has like affordable and green housing for 60% of the population is not really a sustainability plan. So thinking about how can we create conditions so that our students can thrive, I think is actually sustainability. And so I think campus sustainability plans often fall into what I would consider to be traditional environmental issues, like how much are we composting, how much energy are we using, which of course are important. But I think the point of just transition is that we cannot think about these things in isolation. So when we think about campus sustainability, maybe we can think about campus sustainability holistically, right? So like, what does our community need to thrive? And not just community on campus, but outside of campus, because we live in the city that we use as resources. And so rethinking what campus sustainability means away from just how much renewable energy are we generating, how much electricity are our buildings using, to really what are the conditions we can create so that people in our community can thrive.
That's wonderful. I don't think I have much to add to that. That was really, really great. And I think, yeah, imagining campuses as really like connected, part of a place, right? It is its own place, of course, but it's also part of a larger place. That kind of helps maybe transition into this other question from Megan, who was asking kind of around building solidarity across not just the country, but even like international solidarity for just transition movements. And I'll read a little bit of what Megan wrote here. Considering that communities in the global south have often more visible, severe consequences of resource extraction, how do we build solidarity with them to actually build more buy-in from folks here at home to support the impacts abroad? I'm guessing of like climate change more broadly.
Yeah, these are all really hard questions. And I think that this is an instance where it's very easy to talk about coalition building and solidarity, and the reality is very complicated and difficult. So I think acknowledging that is really important, right? Like it's very easy to say these things should happen. It's much more difficult to make them happen. But one thing that I think about, and as we talked about in our critical reading group, is that I think one form of solidarity is that we move away from this idea that the West can build as much energy and use as much energy as they want, while the global South is still waiting to be electrified, right? So I think we can think about things that we can do here that can make conditions better for folks in the global South. And then I think, when we were doing our research, we looked at Kentucky, Louisiana, New York, and California to have a mix of states, both in terms of their political orientation and whether they're an extractive economy and kind of states of transition. And what we found was that also there is this solidarity amongst extractive regions, regardless of geography, right? So folks in California, which are often dismissed as like California is a blue island or whatever, which is totally not true. That those folks that live in the Central Valley actually have quite a lot in common with folks that live in Kentucky, right? And so folks that live in coal regions in Kentucky have a lot in common with folks that live in coal countries, coal communities in India and coal communities in Colombia and then in South Africa. And I think one thing we could think about for this international solidarity are things like the International Trade Union Confederation, right? Which brings unions from different countries together to act and think together and build together. And then you can have lessons from each country that you can then think about how that could be applied in country. So I think in the absence of, obviously, as we talk about in class, the easiest solution would be some kind of international accountability mechanism. But in the absence of that, I think we can think about what we can do in country that creates solidarity and better conditions for folks in the global South, like something like a much more humane consumption system and a much more humane energy system. Then those resources obviously should be given. Something we can advocate for also is free technology transfer, right? So that whatever solar technology exists here should be given for free to the global South, in addition to our own obligation for reparations for the global South for the damage that we have caused since we are driving the climate crisis. And then think about how we can build these transnational networks so that folks can have solidarity across countries. And I really think that anytime you feel solidarity anywhere, you already feel less helpless, right? So maybe we can't be together physically, but solidarity across countries, I think really does build a sense of like, there are more of us. And because there are more of us, eventually we can win.
Yeah, and we were talking just as we were getting on Zoom about the Rio Francos, and thinking a lot about their work on sort of re-energizing internationalism as really fitting well with the question from Megan as well. So might
Yeah,
be
for
someone
sure.
to read from. And yeah, I have a few more here from Will, and we'll maybe just take one or two more so that we
Yeah.
can. Okay, great. So Will is asking a question sort of around green jobs, and I think a lot of us now are kind of wondering whatever happened to green jobs, probably. And certainly from my perspective of like trying to get students into careers that have an environmental or social impact, uh, and a lot of students really want to be in this areas trying to figure that out. But Will is a student focused on thinking about decarbonization and the politics around it. Um, and Will's wondering around asking if you think the sort of movement, I think just transition movement or environmental movement, made a mistake in hyping up the sort of employment benefits of a green transition. Um, and Will goes on to explain, we know a solar farm will not employ as many long-term workers as a fossil power plant, but surely there are plenty of benefits without relying on a jobs argument I'm guessing, for a transition, right, to renewables. So hopefully I did that question justice. Sorry, I paraphrased a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think that that's a really great point. And so I think, for instance, we have one of the challenges of doing climate work, for instance, recently has been in, again, 2008, after the Great Recession, it was supposed to be the green recovery, right? So millions of green jobs. And what happened was that we trained a bunch of folks to do green jobs, and we didn't create a lot of green jobs so that folks were trained for jobs that didn't exist. And I think anytime you do something like this is like a problem with a challenge of transition is you just create a lot of distrust, right? And so I remember again, like trying to talk to folks and talking about job creation, and it became like that's exactly what you said, 5 years ago. I think it's important to remember that there are actually going to be quite a lot of jobs from the energy transition because most of that has to still be built, right? Like we do not have an energy system that is capable of being 100 powered by 100% renewable energy, right? We need to build all those things. If we do, for instance, geothermal, we need to build all those geothermal networks. We need to build efficient housing, right? So a lot of it still has to be built. So I think it's helpful to think about there are some jobs that can be kind of with a little bit of retraining, for instance, can actually be replacement jobs. So construction, for instance, if you construct a pipeline for oil and gas, you probably can construct a pipeline for geothermal. Um, I think the problem with like this is another problem I think with not engaging with directly impacted stakeholders. And I learned a lot talking to actual union members and workers about what work is, right? And so climate people talk about millions of jobs being created. That's largely based on modeling, right? Economic modeling. It doesn't tell you where the jobs are created or what kind of jobs are created, right? So then you end up going to places like Kentucky and talking about how coal miners can become coders, which is just a non-starter on for so many reasons. I think so. I think that really underscores the importance of engaging stakeholders, but also place-based job creation, right? Because, for instance, there are all these solar jobs that are being created, as you mentioned, but most of them are in California because that's mostly where the solar is developed. So that's not going to help folks in Illinois, Indiana, and other coal places. Um, I think it also makes the argument for if every job is a good job, we have to be concerned less about this one-to-one replacement. I think too often climate policy is like trying to think about where these workers can go directly into climate jobs. And I think rather if we think more broadly about if every job is a good job, we can be less concerned about where workers end up, right? Because we know that they will have good jobs. So if a coal miner wants to become a teacher, they should become a teacher, right? We shouldn't try to force them into some kind of job. And we should also be thinking about, we should really expand our idea of what is a green job, right? Because that classification doesn't always include things like care work or teaching, which are very place-based and in fact low carbon jobs. And so if those jobs are, if we consider them as climate jobs and we consider all jobs to be good jobs, then I think it's less of a concern about where people need to go and what the job issue. I think that we do have to talk about that part though, because especially in a country like the US where there is no economic safety net, the first thing when you talk to fossil fuel workers is like, what am I supposed to do? For 18 years, I've been a coal miner. Like, what am I supposed to do? And so I think that if we don't talk about, I kind of can see the argument that we shouldn't put everything in economic terms 100%, but there are real material considerations that people have. And I think as much as we would hope that people would be climate people from the beginning, we need to think about like, where are the ways that we can meet them where they're at? And a lot of it is through jobs and economic security. And so I think the job discussion is important. I think we need to be more nuanced about what we think about in terms of where jobs are lost and where jobs are being created. I think we need to think bigger and making sure that all jobs are good jobs, and then expanding out so that we think about things like care work and education as green jobs, particularly because, again, there's also a gender issue, right? That most of the traditional building trades jobs and other fossil fuel jobs are male dominated, and most care work and education jobs are female dominated. And so if you're only talking about those jobs as needing to be good jobs, you're excluding a huge amount of the workforce. And so I think that we need to broaden what we think of when we think about green jobs. I don't know if that answered the question, but
I think so. Will commented, thank you. I deeply appreciate the thoughtful answer. So I think so.
yeah, thanks.
Um, Great. I have a few more questions here. I think one that I'm going to highlight is thinking around, I guess, sort of like the politics of this moment. And this question is specifically around like differing political views and um, how, like, what the value of a sort of approach like a Green New Deal could be, or if it could be repackaged to fit. Because we know people who would be involved in a just transition are not folks who all agree on political views, right? Or
Yeah,
even general values, maybe. Um,
right.
however, it's a necessity, right? We need to
Yeah.
on climate change. So I guess the question is more around like, what are your thoughts or takes on the sort of politics of a just transition, whether that come under the rubric of a Green New Deal or something else, or if that's just like not the right way to frame it anymore.
I think in this sense, really kind of Democrats and progressives and the left think about messaging too much, right? Like I think um Jamel Bowie, who's a New York Times columnist, had this really interesting thread on Blue Sky where he was talking about, Republicans do something and then just public opinion follows, and Democrats trail public opinion. So then it's like the Green New Deal is polling horribly. We can't say that anymore. And then that becomes like, so what do you really stand for? It's very murky, no? And so I think to the point of the Kentucky organizer, whatever we decide to call it, if it's not, if it's not hand in hand with organizing, it doesn't really matter what we call it, right? I think in this moment, I like to think about what my friend Femi Taiwo says, which is you should organize with people who want you to do something rather than be something, right? And so rather than like, and I think that this can be challenging too, because I think, like, should I organize with someone who's openly racist? That feels hard, right? And so, but I think it's that rather than thinking about, oh, this actually happens in real life, so I think I'm going to joke about it, but like you believe in Trotsky, not Lenin, like, I don't want to talk to you anymore. It's like, then and unfortunately that does actually happen in real life, but you're just like thinking about what your image is or what you want to be, right? You're not doing anything versus like organizing with folks that because you want to organize your workplace, even though maybe you don't have the same values, but you have enough respect for each other that you can focus on the organizing and what your shared values are, which is what organizing is, right? You can't actually organize around something that you don't have shared values around because you don't want the same thing, right? And so that I think is a different situation and that I think not to be too Pollyanna, but I do think that when you talk to folks and build something together, it makes you see the world a little bit differently. And I think that can have lasting change in terms of politics and the vision and the way you see the world. But I think whatever we want to call it, some folks call it green populism. I think all of that is fine. I think 98% of the population will have no idea what you mean when you say green populism. And so rather than thinking about like what the framework is, I think it's maybe helpful to think about what are our values that we share and what are the values that we share, how can we advance them? And that is to me is a way to bring in people, even if you wouldn't necessarily go to the same barbecue.
That's great. Um, I think that's the majority of the questions we have, and so I wanted to, yeah, just maybe open the floor to folks. If you have any other questions, please add them to the Q&A. But also give you some space to maybe have any concluding thoughts or even things that you want to like maybe plug. Obviously, your book. Uh, that being, to the Evergreen community and folks who might watch this on our YouTube channel, for example.
Oh yeah, well, thanks so much, Anthony. And these questions are really wonderful. I want to say that like in this moment, I think everything feels very hard and very scary, and I think it is very hard and very scary. And so I think it is easy to talk about we should do this, we should do that. And I don't want folks to like be too self-critical or too hard on themselves if like it doesn't happen right away, right? Change is very hard and it takes a long time. And I think what the idea of just transition does is it just gives us a way to think about and envision another world. And I think we have to envision the another world before we can actually make it into reality. And so I think, the things that help me through this moment is thinking about one, how can you protect the people that are around you? Two, how could things be different, right? And then I think that helps kind of counter some of the despair about things are really bad. And I honestly have never seen anything like this before. And that can feel really scary. And I think it is really scary. But I think that it only works if we all just accept it, right? And so in any way that you can, I think it's really important to resist. I think it's really important to fight. And I think that looks different for different people. People have different levels of security. And so I think that, but I don't ever want folks to feel like there's nothing that they can do, because maybe there's something that I can do, but there's something that all of us can do together. And whether it's making your community better, whether it's fighting for something at the state level, at a national level, there's always work to be done. And I think that we are only as powerless as we feel. And so the fascists want you to feel like you're powerless, and I just really think it's important to remember that we're not.
Thank you so much for that. And I think that's a really great way to maybe conclude our talk here. I wanted to thank folks who were able to make it here on Zoom today. And again, this will be posted and recorded and posted online for folks who weren't able to. So I'll be happy to share this around. And yeah, just thank you so much for your time, Dr. Cha.
Thank you.
Um, it's been really great to have you. And yeah, I think we'll probably end there and close the meeting. Just some kind words coming through the Q&A from some of the attendees. And yeah, folks really appreciate it as well. So
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it.
thanks.